She never raised her voice. She never had to. By the time Queen Mary entered her room, the room had already rearranged itself. Backs straightened. Conversations became careful. And if you were the unfortunate relative who happened to own something old, something beautiful, something that had been in your family for generations, your blood ran cold. Because admiration from Queen Mary did not stay admiration for long. It had a way of developing very practical consequences. And here is the part that most people never hear. Before she became the most formidable woman in the British monarchy, she was a girl with a title and no money to go with it. A girl who watched her family retreat to the European continent because the creditors had grown louder than the curtsies. A girl who learned young, and without anyone spelling it out for her, that rank and security were not the same thing. That a family could be royal and still be vulnerable. That if life would not hand you safety, you had better learn to build it yourself. Everything that would later make Queen Mary both magnificent and frightening, the control, the collecting, the coldness, the absolute refusal to allow disorder within 50 feet of anything she governed, every one of those qualities had a beginning. They had roots. The kind of roots that form when a child decides, before she is old enough to fully understand the decision, that she will never again be caught without solid ground beneath her feet. This is the story of how she built that ground. And what it cost the people who loved her. If this kind of deep royal history is why you are here, hit that like button right now, subscribe to Chronicles of the Crown, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story. We are just getting started. She came into the world on a spring morning in May of 1867 at Kensington Palace in London. A place soaked in royal memory and domestic tension, which would prove to be an almost perfect description of her entire life. Her full name was a parade by itself. Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes. From the beginning, everyone called her May. It sounded simple. Sweet. Almost modest. There was nothing simple about the family into which she had been born. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a granddaughter of George III, a first cousin of Queen Victoria, and a woman catastrophically relaxed about money. Warm-hearted, sociable, extravagant, she liked entertaining, dressing well, eating well, traveling well, and paying later. Which is a delightful system right up until the later arrives with a louder voice than expected. Her father, Francis, Duke of Teck, had looks, manners, and a title that sounded grand until anyone asked the vulgar follow-up question of what it was actually worth. The answer was not enough. This was May's first lesson, and it arrived before she was old enough to name it. Rank and money were not the same thing. A person could live in royal rooms and still count the cost of candles. A duchess could wear velvet and also owe bills. A child could grow up among princes and still sense, somewhere beneath all the ceremony and the curtsies, that her family was standing on slightly wobbly legs. That sense never left her. It became the engine of everything that came after. The Teck household floated between Kensington Palace and White Lodge in Richmond Park. The children were not neglected, their mother kept them close and brought May along on charitable visits to teach her to move through drawing rooms in poor districts alike without flinching. But there was strain behind the upholstery. The kind of strain that lives in houses where the appearance of comfort is maintained at the cost of enormous, unspoken effort. May was the eldest child and the only daughter. Which meant she absorbed what the others could afford to ignore. She saw social nuance the way some children hear a distant storm before anyone else notices the sky changing. She saw when invitations mattered. She saw who outranked whom. She noticed the faint hesitation in other people whenever her family's position came up for private assessment. The family was royal, yes. But not central. Grand, yes. But never quite secure. That kind of childhood makes a person one of two things. Soft with gratitude, or sharp with determination. May chose sharpness. As a girl, she was not the family duty in the usual sense. She did not light up rooms. She did not charm effortlessly. She was solid, intelligent, observant, and composed. She had presence before she had glamour, which is the more dangerous gift. Pretty girls are noticed immediately. Watchful girls are underestimated. And underestimation gives a person time to learn. She learned at home, educated by governesses in the proper female arts and in the less openly advertised royal skill of emotional self-management. She learned history, languages, religion, and deportment. She learned how to enter a room, how to listen without seeming passive, how to say very little and reveal even less. Her brothers could squabble like ordinary boys. May had already grasped that family life was a politics lesson in miniature, and she was paying very close attention. There was also the matter of things. Beautiful things. Fine objects. Old objects. Objects with stories attached to them. She grew up in rooms where lineage sat in frames and on mantelpieces and in cabinets behind glass. She developed an eye for quality very early, and with that came appetite. Not greed in the obvious, grabbing sense. Nothing so common. Hers was the more aristocratic form. She admired, remembered, categorized, and quietly decided what ought to belong where. Later, people would whisper that when Queen Mary admired something in your house, your blood ran cold. That habit did not appear by magic at 60. It had roots. And those roots were already growing. The Teck's financial troubles deepened through the 1880s until they reached the point polite society called living more economically abroad, a charming phrase for having spent too much and needing distance from the people you owed. The family left Britain for the continent. Florence, among other places. And if humiliation was meant to educate May, it succeeded magnificently. Exile by debt is a very specific kind of lesson. It tells you that a name alone does not save you. It tells you that comfort can vanish. It tells you that if you ever get your hands on stability, you do not release it. In Italy, May saw art, churches, old collections, dynasties preserved in stone and velvet. She saw the connection between possession and permanence. A family that owned treasures looked like a family that intended to last. A family forced to retreat because it could not pay its way looked like a warning. She filed both observations. She did not forget either. The strange thing about Mary's later reputation for severity is that people speak of it as though it arrived fully formed, dropped from the sky without explanation. But severity is very often fear in formal clothes. Her control, her collecting, her obsession with order, her refusal to be emotionally messy in public, all of it makes far more sense when you remember the girl who knew the carpet might be royal and the accounts might still be a disaster. She did not simply want a throne. She wanted insulation against disgrace. By the time the family returned to Britain, May had become exactly the kind of princess the monarchy could use. Born in Britain, which mattered deeply to Queen Victoria. Excellent connections. Respectable blood. None of the threatening glamour that might make an older woman uneasy. She was beautiful, sensible, and serious, the kind of young woman grandmothers describe as having a good head on her shoulders, often because they are hoping to place a crown above it later. Suitable. One of the most dangerous words in aristocratic life. It sounds perfectly harmless. It can rearrange destiny. The answer before long circled around one of the most eligible young men in Britain. Prince Albert Victor, known in the family as Eddie. Eldest son of the Prince of Wales. Second in line to the throne. History has not treated Eddie with great confidence. He has been called charming, vague, gentle, decorative. He was handsome enough, amiable enough, and important enough, which in royal markets is usually sufficient. May and Eddie became engaged in 1891. Queen Victoria approved. The country saw a respectable match. May seemed genuinely attached to Eddie, or at the very least ready to do what had always been expected of her with the calm seriousness that was her particular gift. She made enormous acts of surrender look like composure. For a girl who had known proximity without security, this was not just a triumph. It was rescue. Then the rescue died. In January of 1892, Eddie fell ill during an influenza epidemic and developed pneumonia. Within days he was dead. He was not yet 28. Britain grieved a lost prince. And May found herself in a position of particular cruelty. She was not exactly a widow, because she had never become a wife. But she had been publicly chosen and then publicly stranded. In another family, she might have been gently released. In this one, she remained close. There has always been something slightly chilling in how smoothly the next arrangement formed. Not immediately, not with the vulgar haste of gossip, but with unmistakable purpose. Queen Victoria remained fond of May and did not want to lose her. The next son, Prince George, Duke of York, suddenly carried heavier expectations. And May, with her discipline and her trained instinct for survival, did not drift away into private disappointment. She stayed in orbit. George was very different from Eddie. Shy, naval, plain-spoken, and much harder in grain. If Eddie had drifted through royal life like a decorative cloud, George came with the plain furniture and the weather report. He was not dazzling. He was durable. But something important happened in the interval between these two men. It happened inside Mary. Loss did not soften her. It refined her. She had seen how quickly fate could rearrange the seating plan. She became even more self-controlled. Even more careful. Even more committed to the principle that personal feeling must be managed, not displayed. George proposed in 1893. May accepted. The wedding took place that July at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. London turned out for the spectacle. There was relief in the air, relief that the disrupted story had been patched, relief that the dynasty had its footing back. The public liked a romantic story. The palace preferred continuity. Everybody got something they wanted. Mary, now Duchess of York, stepped into married life with the composure of a woman who had been rehearsing for a throne for years. George loved her in his own restrained fashion. He trusted her, which was no small thing for a man suspicious by temperament. They made sense together, both disciplined, both devoted to duty, both far more comfortable with structure than with emotional chaos. It was not a marriage built for sparkling conversation over breakfast. It was built to last through paperwork, ceremony, childbirth, grief, and constitutional weather. And yet those who watched closely could already see the other side of Mary taking shape. She was not merely settling into royal life. She was mastering it. Rooms mattered to her. Precedents mattered. Objects mattered. Correctness mattered. She noticed everything. She remembered everything. She had patience for ritual because ritual was power in visible form. If she could not be born at the very center, she would behave so impeccably that the center adjusted around her. George collected stamps. Mary collected legitimacy. She gathered it from architecture, family relics, etiquette, and memory. She understood that the crown did not survive by glitter alone. It survived by convincing people that continuity existed. That history sat solidly in the same rooms year after year. That someone serious was in charge of the keys. The trouble with becoming the guardian of order is that one can begin to love order more than people. In Mary, that danger was present early. Her harder qualities arrived dressed as virtue. If she was ambitious, it looked like duty. If she was inquisitive, it looked like preservation. If she was cold, it looked like dignity. She could be severe and still seem useful. That combination is almost irresistible in a palace. Very quickly, children arrived. Edward in 1894. Albert the year after. Then Mary in 1897. Henry in 1900. George in 1902. And John in 1905. On paper, it looked like everything a dynasty could want. In practice, it revealed one of the traits that would cling to Mary's reputation long after the lace and the diamonds had turned into museum pieces. She was not a naturally easy mother. That does not mean she did not care. It means her caring was filtered through discipline, distance, and a belief that children should fit the institution long before the institution ever tried to fit them. The nursery was governed with regularity. Rules mattered. Manners mattered. Emotional spontaneity did not enjoy nearly the same status. What she offered her children was consistency, seriousness, and an almost religious respect for the role they had been born into. What she did not always offer was softness. David, the eldest, bright, charming, deeply responsive to attention, learned early that attention could come from many places outside the nursery if it was not always warm enough within it. Bertie, quieter and more anxious and more easily hurt, learned something harsher, that love in such a household could feel entangled with correction. When he stammered, when his sensitive nature collided with the stiff expectations of royal masculinity, the atmosphere around him was not one of broad indulgence. It was one of management. There was a logic to Mary's manner. And logic is often where the damage hides best. Before this story moves forward, there is one chapter that tends to be told quietly, if it is told at all. And it deserves to be heard. Prince John was the youngest of the 6 children. Born in 1905, he suffered from epilepsy and was believed to have some developmental difficulties. In a family obsessed with public image and dynastic strength, his condition could not be acknowledged lightly. Illness in royal households was never merely medical. It threatened the story of vigor and fitness that monarchy likes to tell about itself. John was increasingly kept apart from the center of family life. For much of his childhood it would farm on the Sandringham estate, cared for by his nurse, at a remove that later generations would find difficult to contemplate without sadness. One should be careful with hindsight. Families across classes and countries routinely concealed disability and chronic illness in those years. Yet caution does not erase the loneliness of the arrangement. What is striking is not only that it happened. It is how naturally it fit a household whose deepest instinct was to separate difficulty from display. John died in January of 1919, at the age of 13, after a severe epileptic seizure at Wood Farm, with his nurse beside him. Mary's diary entries and letters suggest real sorrow. No fair account should deny that. Yet the poignancy of his death only underscored the life he had lived, sheltered away, beloved in some fashion and separated in another. The family mourned him. The public knew almost nothing. Even grief in this household moved through curtains. When Queen Victoria died in January of 1901, the British monarchy changed mood overnight. Bertie became Edward VII. Alexandra became Queen. George and Mary rose to become Prince and Princess of Wales. For Mary this was significant. She was no longer the sensible younger generation waiting in the wings. She was now directly before the public as the future queen. And rather than relaxing into the role, she hardened into it with even greater confidence. When Edward VII died in May of 1910, George became king and Mary became queen consort. The insecure child of a debt-troubled house had reached the summit of British royal life. The coronation of George V and Queen Mary at Westminster Abbey in June of 1911 made this visible to the world. She did not look carried away by the emotional grandeur of the moment. She looked as if she had accepted a burden she had long expected, and intended to carry it properly, whether the burden found this charming or not. Many admired that. Some loved it. Others felt, without daring to say so, that the new queen seemed less like a woman entering glory than like a high priestess entering possession of the vault. She took to royal houses with the interest of a scholar and the resolve of an auditor who has spotted an undeclared asset. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, Balmoral all came under her eye. If an object had history, quality, or dynastic significance, Mary cared. If it belonged to another branch of the family and might be better placed under central royal control, she cared most of all. She could praise an object, recall its provenance, remark on how beautifully it would sit in such and such a royal room, and let the moral pressure of the situation do the rest. Very few people are eager to be remembered as the cousin who denied the crown its rightful commode. She did not have to bully. She had better methods. And this brings us to the question underneath every chapter of her life. Why did everyone play along? Her harder qualities were no mystery to those around her. People saw that she liked possession. They saw that slights were remembered and carefully filed. They saw that she preferred obedience to intimacy. And yet they played along every time. Because she was useful. Because she could transform appetite into guardianship with a straight face and enough genuine belief to make the transformation convincing. If she wanted an object, it was because it ought to remain in royal hands. If she kept emotional distance, it was because dignity required it. She was not lying, exactly. She was selecting the noblest available explanation and living inside it so completely that many people preferred not to inspect the foundations too closely. The most revealing thing about such people is not their enemies. It is their accomplices. If this story is gripping you the way we hoped it would, this is the moment to hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Chronicles of the Crown. There is so much more of this story still to come, and it only gets darker. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 put every instinct Mary possessed into overdrive. The monarchy suddenly had to prove itself not merely ceremonial, but national. Mary excelled in this. She was tireless. She understood at once that the crown must be visible, dutiful, and morally aligned with sacrifice. But the war also brought one of the most revealing crises of the reign, the question of dynasty itself. The British royal house was deeply entangled with German ancestry, titles, and cousins. In peacetime, manageable. In wartime, with anti-German feeling running at full heat and bombs falling from German aircraft, it became dangerous. George V was of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha through his father. German names no longer sounded merely foreign. They sounded like the enemy. In 1917, George renounced the German family name. The British royal house became the House of Windsor. Mary supported it without hesitation. She understood symbols better than most politicians and many priests. If the monarchy needed a new name to remain acceptable to the country, then it would have one. She did what preservation required. This is where her admirers found her magnificent. She was splendid in crisis because crisis rewarded her central belief that institutions survive through firmness, discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice personal sentiment when the occasion demands it. There was grandeur in that. There was also hardness. She felt deeply about the crown because she had fused herself to it. And once that fusion occurs, other loyalties become conditional. By the 1920s, Queen Mary had become something close to a monument. Her reserve had been renamed Majesty. Her fastidiousness had become standards. Her possessiveness had become guardianship. Every quality that felt difficult at close range looked, from a ceremonial distance, almost ideal. The court no longer lounged. It stood upright. But her eldest son was becoming a problem of a very particular kind. David, Prince of Wales after his father's accession, was the most watched bachelor in the empire. He had ease, charm, and that dangerous quality Mary distrusted most in public figures. He genuinely liked being liked. He had a gift for making ordinary people feel briefly visible. This is wonderful in a charitable patron and deeply alarming in a future king who also happens to dislike paperwork, avoid discipline, and chase emotional rescue in entirely the wrong places. He was drawn not to suitable royal candidates but to married women, sophisticated women, unsuitable women. Women who knew how to flatter his loneliness. Mary had no patience for this. She believed in marriage as duty, alliance, and structure. David looked for warmth, admiration, and escape. She saw not romance, but dereliction. The friction between them deepened because they misunderstood one another at the level of instinct. David thought Mary cold and incapable of recognizing the emotional hunger at the center of his life. Mary thought David weak and perilously unable to understand that his feelings were a secondary matter in the business of kingship. Both had a point. Which is usually the worst possible foundation for family peace. When he disappointed her, she did not melt into concerned speeches. She froze into judgment. Mary had a remarkable talent for making disapproval feel tidy. There would be no raised voice, no flung accusation. Instead, there would be a tightening of atmosphere. A letter phrased with controlled gravity. A tone at the table that informed everyone the moral weather had shifted. Children of warmer mothers often complain of shouting. Children of colder mothers spend years reacting to silence. Meanwhile, George V's health was worsening. The succession no longer belonged to some distant future. It was approaching. And the man waiting for it was still behaving like a prince who believed feeling and longing could govern a life without expensive consequences arriving later. George V's final months were marked by the quiet devastation of a man whose body had finally outrun his willpower. He had ruled for more than 25 years and done it with dogged seriousness rather than brilliance. Mary had been beside him throughout, arranging, supporting, steadying, carrying the invisible weight that keeps a monarchy looking smoother than the people inside it actually feel. When the end came in January of 1936, she did what she always did. She controlled herself. David became King Edward VIII. Mary became Queen Mother, still influential, still formidable, but no longer the woman beside the sovereign. For most widows, the first shock is personal loss. For Mary, there was also political dread. Because the person now sitting on the throne was the son she trusted least. By the time he came to the throne, Wallis Simpson was already firmly at the center of his emotional life. Wallis was American, socially clever, twice divorced, fashionable, sharp-edged, and possessed of exactly the sort of worldly confidence Mary regarded as dangerous in the vicinity of men like Edward. To Mary's mind, the situation was not merely inappropriate. It was an assault on structure itself. A king could not simply decide that his private feelings outranked the church, the government, and the constitutional expectations attached to the crown. Desire was not the issue. Submission to duty was the issue. And Mary had made a life out of submission to duty, though she would never have used such a humble-sounding phrase for what she considered, simply, character. Her position was clear from the very beginning. Edward must give up Wallis, or he must give up the throne. What wounded her most was not simply the possible marriage. It was what the whole episode represented. Edward was placing personal desire above inherited duty in the most public way imaginable. She had built her entire life around the premise that self-denial was the price of legitimacy. Watching her eldest son reject that principle felt like watching someone smash the family altar because he preferred the view from the window. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made the government's position clear. The Dominions and the Church of England both made their positions clear. The establishment closed ranks. Mary wrote to her son. She spoke to him. She made plain, with the icy clarity she reserved for moments of deepest conviction, what he was doing to his father's memory, to the crown, to the family, and to the entire structure for which generations had paid in full. On the 10th of December, 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication. The following day, in his broadcast to the nation, he told the country he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. It was one of the most famous sentences ever spoken by a British royal. To Mary, it must have sounded less like romance than like final confirmation of everything she had feared. A king was not supposed to explain himself as if he were the hero of a private melodrama. He was supposed to endure. If Edward fell, Bertie had to rise. The shy second son became George VI. He took the regal name deliberately, linking himself to his father, signaling continuity after the rupture of abdication. It was a quietly moving decision, because everyone who witnessed it understood the cost. Bertie was stepping into a role for which he felt painfully unready, precisely because his elder brother had refused it. Mary supported him with all the force she possessed. Here, at last, her severity became a form of rescue. She gave Bertie what she knew best how to give: a structure, precedent, legitimacy, and unspoken pressure to stand firm. Elizabeth, now Queen, provided the warmth and confidence he needed at close range. Mary provided the weight of the institution behind him. Between these two women, George VI was held upright. Edward, now Duke of Windsor, left Britain. Wallis obtained her divorce and married him in June of 1937 in France. None of the senior royal family attended the wedding. That absence said everything. Mary would not legitimize what she believed had disgraced the crown. She maintained a line between the central dynasty and the exiled couple that was both political and deeply personal. In Mary's eyes, Edward had chosen his life. He could live it elsewhere. When Britain entered the Second World War in September of 1939, the royal family had barely recovered its balance from the abdication. And above them all, like a carved figure from some older and sterner chapel of monarchy, stood Queen Mary. Widow. Mother. Grandmother. Guardian of standards. Living reminder that dynasties are expected to continue even when history has lost its temper. This was the kind of crisis in which she was at her most impressive. The qualities that could make her exhausting in private often made her magnificent in public emergency. She did not panic. She did not demand comfort from the nation while the nation itself was bracing for bombardment. She understood at once that the monarchy had to represent endurance above all else. George VI and Queen Elizabeth did so brilliantly, remaining in Britain, remaining visible, associating themselves with the common danger. Bertie, who had once seemed the anxious spare, performed kingship with a seriousness that made people respect him all the more for the obvious effort it required. The crown, which so often looks decorative in peacetime, suddenly looked necessary. At last, here was proof that the son who had inherited the throne unwillingly was made of stronger material than the son who had thrown it away. Vindication was more her style than satisfaction. And war gave it to her in a steady supply. The war brought grief more directly in 1942, with the death of George, Duke of Kent, one of her younger sons. His aircraft crashed in Scotland while he was on active service. The loss cut deeply. She grieved with the same controlled intensity she brought to everything, privately, without surrender to public display. Pain was acknowledged, arranged, folded into duty, and kept moving. Some people find this heroic. Others find it almost unbearable to imagine. Both reactions are entirely understandable. Among all the people in Mary's long life, one relationship in the final decades carried a particular quality of recognition. Princess Elizabeth, the future queen, was born in 1926. From early childhood she was serious, observant, and possessed of a strange, calm self-possession that distinguished her from almost everyone around her. Mary watched her granddaughter with the concentrated attention she reserved for matters of genuine consequence. What she saw was a girl who absorbed duty without complaint. A girl with steadiness, reserve, and most valuably, patience. Elizabeth was not trying to be dazzling. She was trying to be correct. In the granddaughter, Mary seems to have seen something rare, continuity without collapse. A future sovereign who might combine the steadiness she valued with enough human warmth to make it palatable to a changing world in ways that Mary herself had not always managed, and had not always tried. It is telling that Mary, who had often found her own children wanting, regarded the young Elizabeth with particular and visible respect. Not cuddling. By Mary's standards, something far better. Respect. George VI's health was failing as the early 1950s arrived. The king died in February of 1952 at Sandringham. Elizabeth, in Kenya at the time, became queen. Another reign ended. Another began. For Mary, one more terrible confirmation that the institution moved on regardless of who was ready. She attended the funeral of her son with the same grave composure she had shown at so many family graves before. There is something almost pitiless about how often history asked her to stand straight beside coffins. Mary never broke. That was her strength. And her prison. She died in March of 1953, just weeks before Elizabeth's coronation. The timing feels almost too precise, as if history, having made full use of her as one of its sternest custodians, decided she could leave once the succession was secured, and not a moment before. She had witnessed the beginning of the new reign. She could depart before the full spectacle, which somehow suits the woman she was entirely. She did not need to remain in the frame. She needed the system to continue. It did. She could go. The public mourning for Queen Mary emphasized her service, her dignity, her scholarship, and her lifelong association with the crown. All of that was true. But it was not the whole picture. The whisper that followed her through life, that she was cold, possessive, that she liked control far more than was comfortable for the people required to live around it, that admiration for beautiful objects had a way of ending with those objects changing address, that whisper was also true. It was not gossip. It was observation. The open secret that everyone around her acknowledged, adjusted for, and almost never directly challenged, because her difficult qualities so frequently came attached to genuine usefulness. She was a child of insecurity who built her life around control. A woman taught early that rank without security was humiliation waiting politely in the hall. A mother who believed duty mattered more than softness, and left marks that could not be seen in any official portrait. A queen who transformed appetite into preservation so convincingly that history still debates where one ended and the other began. A matriarch who could help save a monarchy and simultaneously make private love feel subject to audit. And perhaps that is why she remains so compelling. She reveals something the monarchy has never liked to say out loud. The people best at preserving it are not always the people one would most want as a mother. The virtues of institutions and the virtues of intimacy are not the same thing. Mary possessed the first kind in extraordinary measure. The second she kept in reserve, rationed, guarded, and sometimes buried so deeply beneath role and ritual that only the luckiest people in her life ever felt it arrive unfiltered. She wanted permanence. She got it. Not the warm, effortless permanence of being universally beloved. The harder kind. The kind earned by those who make themselves indispensable. Who survive. Who preserve. Who judge. Who collect. Who endure. Who are thanked in public and whispered about in private, long after the funeral flowers have been cleared away. In the end, that may have suited Mary of Teck perfectly. She did not need everyone to love her. She needed them to continue the arrangement. They did. And in many ways, they still do. That is the story of Queen Mary of Teck, one of the most formidable, complex, and quietly terrifying figures in the entire history of the British Crown. A woman who built a fortress out of perfect manners and called it duty. A woman who saved the monarchy more than once, and made the people she loved feel the weight of every single rescue. If this video kept you watching all the way to the end, it would mean everything to us here at Chronicles of the Crown. Hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who loves royal history, someone who thinks they already know this story and deserves to find out how much they have been missing. Subscribe to Chronicles of the Crown so you never miss a single episode, because the stories we have coming will change how you see the British royal family, their wealth, their secrets, and the sacrifices that built the crown we know today. We will see you in the next one.